Greed destroyed his inheritance with a single stroke of a legal pen. Banished to a rotting, mold-infested shack by his wicked stepmother, David thought his future was permanently erased. Instead, a hidden steel vault beneath those decaying floorboards concealed a billion-dollar Swiss secret that would mercilessly destroy them all. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Wallace F. Grendel's mahogany-paneled law office in Lower Manhattan, casting long, weeping shadows across the room. David Carmichael sat rigidly in a high-backed leather chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. Across the heavy oak desk sat his stepmother Elise, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Next to her slouched her biological son Conrad, who was entirely too engrossed in a text message conversation to feign grief over a man who had practically raised him. Arthur Thomas Carmichael, David's grandfather and the founder of Carmichael Global Logistics, had been dead for exactly 7 days. Arthur was a titan of industry, a man who had built a multi-billion-dollar shipping empire out of a single rusted freighter in the late 70s. For the last 5 years, David had been his grandfather's shadow, his primary caretaker, and his chosen apprentice. Arthur had promised David repeatedly, and in front of witnesses, that he would inherit the controlling shares of the company. It was the only reason David had sacrificed his 20s, working 80-hour weeks, and abandoning his own ambitions to ensure his grandfather's legacy remained intact. Attorney Grendel, a man whose face looked as though it were perpetually carved from grey stone, adjusted his reading glasses. "If we are all ready, I shall proceed with the final testament of Arthur Thomas Carmichael." Elise nodded solemnly, a subtle, razor-thin smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Grendel began to read the dense legal jargon. At first it was standard procedure: charitable donations to the local hospitals, a trust fund established for the retired dock workers, and a few minor bequests to household staff. But as the reading progressed to the primary assets, the atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. "To my devoted wife, Elise Carmichael, I leave the Central Park West penthouse, the estate in East Hampton, and 51% of the voting shares of Carmichael Global Logistics. Furthermore, I leave all domestic bank accounts, including the Morgan Stanley portfolios, to her sole discretion." David's stomach plummeted. He leaned forward, the leather chair squeaking in the quiet room. "Wait, that can't be right." Grendel did not look up. "To my legally adopted son Conrad, I leave the entirety of my vintage automobile collection, as well as the offshore holding accounts located in the Cayman Islands." "Mr. Grendel, stop!" David interrupted his voice, trembling with a mixture of shock and rising anger. "My grandfather and I drew up the succession plan 3 months ago. He explicitly stated that the voting shares were to be held in a trust for me. He knew Elise had no experience running a logistics firm." Elise lowered her handkerchief, her eyes flashing with sudden cold malice. "David, please. Your grandfather's mind was failing him at the end. We all saw it. He realized you weren't ready for the burden of a global corporation. He made this new will just 3 weeks ago to protect the family." 3 weeks ago, he didn't even know what year it was," David snapped, rising to his feet. "You were heavily medicating him. You bribed those private nurses to isolate him from me. This will is fraudulent." "That is quite enough, David," Grendel said, finally looking up over his spectacles. "This document was signed in my presence and notarized by a state official. It is ironclad. Now please sit down so I may finish." David sank back into his chair, a heavy numbness spreading through his chest. He was drowning in debt from his own late mother's medical bills, a burden he had only taken on because Arthur had assured him his future was entirely secure. Now he had nothing. Grendel cleared his throat once more. "And finally to my grandson, David Carmichael. For his years of service, I leave the entirety of the real estate asset, including all land and structures, located at 442 Hemlock Lane, Carbon County, Pennsylvania. Conrad let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter. Elise quickly shushed him, but the amusement in her eyes was unmistakable. Hemlock Lane, David whispered. He knew the property. Arthur had purchased it in the 1980s during a brief, ill-advised hunting phase. It was a derelict Victorian farmhouse on an isolated plot of land near the town of Jim Thorpe. It had been completely abandoned for nearly 40 years. It wasn't an inheritance. It was an insult. "That concludes the reading," Grendel said, folding the heavy parchment. "You planned this," David said, his voice deadly quiet as he looked at Elise. "You waited until he was vulnerable, and you stole everything." Elise stood up, smoothing the front of her black Chanel suit. "I think it's time you leave, David. In fact, I expect you to have your personal belongings cleared out of the Central Park West penthouse by 5 o'clock this evening. I've already instructed the building's security to revoke your access keys." 2 hours later, David stood on the sidewalk in the pouring Manhattan rain. 2 large garbage bags containing his clothes, a box of personal files, and a few framed photographs were shoved into the back of his aging, rattling Ford Escape. He had $400 in his checking account. The company he had helped run was gone. His home was gone. His grandfather was gone. With nowhere else to go and no money to rent an apartment in the city, David turned the ignition key. The engine sputtered in protest before roaring to life. He merged onto Interstate 80 West, driving toward the mountains of Pennsylvania. He was exiled, utterly defeated, heading toward a rotting piece of timber that was meant to be his graveyard. The town of Jim Thorpe was nestled deep in a steep gorge of the Lehigh River, often called the Switzerland of America, for its dramatic scenery and Victorian architecture. But 442 Hemlock Lane was miles outside the picturesque town center, buried deep in a dense, suffocating forest of old-growth pines. David arrived just as the sun was setting the headlights of his Ford, cutting through the thick mountain fog. He pulled into a driveway completely choked with briars and aggressive ivy. At the end of the dirt path stood his inheritance. It was a nightmare of neglect. The 2-story Victorian farmhouse was visibly sagging, looking as though it were preparing to collapse under the weight of its own decay. Half the roof shingles were missing, leaving exposed water-rotted wood. The wraparound porch had caved in on the left side, and every single window on the first floor was shattered. David stepped out of the car, his boots sinking into deep, foul-smelling mud. He carefully navigated the treacherous porch steps and pushed the front door. It wasn't even locked. The frame had warped so badly that the door was jammed half open. The smell hit him instantly, a suffocating mixture of black mold, damp earth, feral animal urine, and decaying timber. He clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight, sweeping the beam across the living room. The wallpaper was peeling off in long, curled strips like dead skin. The hardwood floor was buckled and spongy, covered in a thick layer of wet leaves and debris that had blown in through the broken windows. "Thanks, Grandpa," David muttered into the empty freezing house. "Really set me up for success here." He spent his first night sleeping in the driver's seat of his car, shivering under a thin fleece blanket. When morning finally broke, revealing the bleak grey reality of his situation, David made a decision. He couldn't live here, but if he could clear out the worst of the debris and patch the roof, he might be able to sell the land to a developer for $20,000 or $30,000. It would be enough to get an apartment and a decent lawyer to at least contest Elise's fraudulent will. He drove into town to McCarthy's Hardware, spending almost his entire remaining cash on heavy-duty trash bags, a respirator mask work, gloves, a crowbar, and a hammer. By noon, David was back at the house, viciously tearing into the ruined living room. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from the boiling anger in his chest. He hauled out bags of rotted furniture, shattered glass, and damp debris. He decided to start ripping up the completely unsalvageable waterlogged carpet in the center of the room. As he drove the rusted crowbar under a particularly stubborn section of the floor near the large stone fireplace, he applied his full weight. Crack! The floorboards didn't just splinter. A massive 3-foot section of the floor suddenly gave way, plunging downward. David scrambled backward, narrowly avoiding falling into the black void that had just opened up. Panting, he crawled to the edge of the jagged hole, shining his flashlight down. He expected to see the dirt floor of a crawl space. Instead, the beam of light reflected off something dull and metallic. It was a solid steel subfloor, reinforced with thick concrete. Resting squarely in the center of the cavity, bolted directly into the foundation of the house, was a massive, custom-built vault door. David's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He lowered himself into the 2-foot depression. The vault was covered in a layer of dust and spiderwebs, but the steel was completely free of rust. In the center of the heavy door was an old-school mechanical combination dial manufactured by a high-end security firm. Why would a derelict hunting cabin have a bank-grade vault hidden beneath the floorboards? He knelt over the dial. He had absolutely no idea what the combination could be. If this was Arthur's doing, he would have chosen something Elise would never guess. It wouldn't be a birthday, an anniversary, or a standard passcode. Arthur was notoriously paranoid about digital security, preferring the old ways. David closed his eyes, thinking back to his childhood. What was their most significant shared memory Arthur used to take him fishing off the coast of Montauk every summer, before the business consumed both their lives? There was one specific day, the day David caught a massive striped bass, a day Arthur always referenced when talking about patience and timing. August 14th, 1998. David reached out with trembling, dirt-caked fingers. He spun the cold metal dial. 0, 8, 1, 4, 9, 8. He grabbed the heavy steel lever and pulled. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, echoing clack of heavy tumblers sliding into place, the pressure seal broke. The door groaned loudly as David hauled it upward on its heavy hydraulic hinges. A wave of dry, stale air rushed out of the climate-controlled chamber. David directed his flashlight inside. The vault was surprisingly deep. Stacked neatly on the left side were bricks of United States currency. They were old hundreds, the pre-redesigned bills bound in tight bank-issued paper straps. A quick calculation told David there was easily $500,000 in physical cash sitting there. But it wasn't the money that made David freeze. It was what sat next to it. Resting on a velvet-lined shelf was a thick, antique leather binder stamped with the crest of Pictet and Sierre, one of the most exclusive and secretive private banks in Geneva, Switzerland. On top of the binder was a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. Printed across the front of the envelope, in Arthur Carmichael's distinct, steady, pre-dementia handwriting, was a single name, David. David tore the envelope open. The letter inside was dated nearly 2 years ago, long before Arthur's mind had begun to slip. My dearest David, if you are reading this, standing in the rotting shell of this terrible house, it means my mind finally gave out, and Elise played her hand exactly as I calculated she would. She thinks she is brilliant. She thinks she has outmaneuvered us both by slipping me sedatives and having her own lawyers rewrite my final will. Let her think it. For the last 10 years I have known what she was planning, but I also knew that if I cut her out directly, she would tie you up in probate court for decades, draining your resources until you surrendered. So I let her steal the shell of the company. I let her take the houses and the domestic bank accounts. What Elise and that fool Grendel do not know is that 3 years ago, I legally transferred the vast majority of my true wealth, the bearer bonds, the rare physical gold certificates, and the controlling shadow company shares that actually dictate Carmichael Logistics' board of directors into a blind trust. This trust is completely untraceable and entirely offshore. The legal trigger to activate this trust and claim sole ownership of these assets is tied to one specific obscure requirement. The claimant must be the legal deeded owner of the property at 442 Hemlock Lane. Elise thought she was handing you a worthless pile of rotting wood to humiliate you. In reality, by signing that deed over to you, she legally handed you the keys to a $2 billion empire. The ledger in this vault contains all the account numbers, access codes, and the contact information for my private legal counsel, in Zurich, Judge Richard H. Pembroke. He is waiting for your call. Take the cash, hire the best shark in New York, and take everything back. Love, Grandad. David lowered the letter, the silence of the rotting house suddenly deafening. He looked at the stacks of cash, the Swiss ledger, and the incredible vindictive genius of the man who had raised him. The despair that had choked him for a week evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing fire. Elise had exiled him to a graveyard, entirely unaware she had just handed him the most destructive weapon imaginable. David smiled, the expression tight and dangerous in the dim light. The war hadn't ended in that Manhattan law office. It was just beginning. Packing the cash into heavy duffel bags took less than an hour, but wrapping his mind around his grandfather's masterstroke took the entire night. David sat on the floor of the decaying Victorian house, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the thick pages of the Pictet and Saye ledger. Arthur Carmichael had not simply hidden money. He had orchestrated a financial phantom strike. The ledger detailed a labyrinth of offshore accounts, but more importantly, it outlined the true corporate structure of Carmichael Global Logistics. For decades, the public and the board of directors believed Arthur personally held the 51% of supervoting Class B shares. However, the ledger proved that 3 years prior to his death, Arthur had quietly transferred those supervoting shares into an anonymous holding entity called the Vanguard Horizon Group. Vanguard Horizon was entirely controlled by a blind trust registered in Geneva, and the sole irrevocable trigger to claim ownership of that trust was the legal recorded deed to 442 Hemlock Lane. Elise, in her petty desire to humiliate David by giving him a ruined, worthless property, had officially and legally handed him the absolute control of the entire corporate empire. By sunrise, David was moving. He loaded the cash and the documents into his Ford Escape, locked the warped front door, and drove into Jim Thorpe. He purchased a secure encrypted burner smartphone and a heavy-duty portable safe. Sitting in the parking lot of a local diner drinking terrible coffee, he dialed the international number for Judge Richard H. Pembroke in Zurich. The phone rang twice before a crisp, heavily accented voice answered. Pembroke. Mr. Pembroke, my name is David Carmichael. I am calling regarding the Hemlock Trust. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Carmichael, I have been waiting for this call with great anticipation. I was terribly sorry to hear of your grandfather's passing. He was a brilliant man. Do you have the primary ledger? I have it right in front of me, David replied, his heart hammering. And I have the deed to Hemlock Lane. My stepmother's attorney, Wallace F. Grendel, executed the transfer yesterday morning. A low chuckle echoed through the receiver. Arthur told me she would do exactly that. He predicted her greed would blind her to the details. Mr. Carmichael, as of the moment the deed was recorded with the county clerk, You became the sole beneficiary of the Vanguard Horizon Group. You possess 80% of the voting power in Carmichael Global Logistics. Elise possesses nothing but phantom shares. How do I enforce it? David asked, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Elise and her son are currently occupying the executive suite. They think they own everything. You need a domestic weapon, Pembroke stated flatly. You need the most ruthless corporate litigator in New York. Someone who despises Wallace F. Grendel and isn't afraid to rip the doors off their hinges. Go to Manhattan. Walk into the offices of Montgomery, Hughes and Partners. Ask for Charles R. Montgomery. I will wire a $5 million retainer from your trust to his firm's account within the hour. Hand him the ledger, and he will handle the execution. 48 hours later, David stepped off the elevator onto the 60th floor of a towering glass skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. He was no longer the muddy, defeated exile who had driven into the Pennsylvania mountains. Clad in a sharply tailored navy Brioni suit, paid for with the cash from the floorboards, he walked with the posture of a CEO. Charles R. Montgomery was a silver-haired legal titan who looked like a man who enjoyed ruining lives before his morning espresso. He sat behind a massive glass desk, examining the original documents from the vault. I have to admit, David, Montgomery said, leaning back and steepling his fingers. I have practiced corporate law for 40 years, and your grandfather's trap is the most vindictive, beautiful piece of estate planning I have ever seen. Elise's lawyers assumed the Class B shares were tied to the domestic portfolio she inherited. They didn't do their due diligence. They didn't check the historical chain of custody. Can we remove her? David asked, his voice steady. Montgomery smiled, revealing perfectly white, predatory teeth. Remove her, son. We are going to obliterate her. According to my inside sources, Elise has called an emergency shareholder meeting for tomorrow morning. She is attempting to force a vote to liquidate the International Shipping Division and sell off the fleet to Maersk for a quick cash grab. She wants billions in her personal bank account before the week is out. She's destroying my grandfather's life's work, David said, his jaw clenching. She is attempting to, Montgomery corrected. But she needs a majority shareholder vote to authorize the liquidation. She thinks she has 51%. Tomorrow we walk into that boardroom and we show her exactly what she actually inherited. The executive boardroom of Carmichael Global Logistics was a monument to corporate power. Overlooking the Hudson River, the room was dominated by a 40-foot mahogany table. Elise sat at the head of the table, radiating arrogant triumph. She wore a pristine white designer suit, sipping sparkling water, as she looked down at the assembled board of directors. Conrad sat slouched to her right, aggressively chewing gum and scrolling through a catalogue of luxury yachts on his tablet. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. Elise began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. As the new controlling owner of this company, I have taken a hard look at our assets. Arthur was a sentimental man. But I am a realist. The international fleet is a liability. By liquidating these assets, we can secure an immediate, massive dividend for all shareholders. My legal counsel, Mr. Grendel, has prepared the authorization documents. Grendel, sitting rigidly nearby, began passing out thick stacks of paper. As Elise controls 51% of the voting shares, this vote is largely a formality, but we require it for the public record. Are there any objections before we sign? Elise asked, already reaching for her gold fountain pen. I have a rather significant objection, a voice echoed from the back of the room. The heavy double doors swung open. David strode into the boardroom, flanked by Charles R. Montgomery and two massive, unsmiling security contractors. The color instantly drained from Elise's face. She stood up, slamming her hands on the table. What is the meaning of this, David? You are trespassing. Security. Remove this man immediately. The building's internal security guards standing by the walls stepped forward, but Montgomery raised a single commanding hand. "I would strongly advise against touching my client." Montgomery boomed his voice, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Unless you wish to be named in a multi-million-dollar civil suit for assaulting the legal owner of this corporation." Grendel scoffed, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Charles, you are out of your jurisdiction." This young man was disinherited. "Elise holds the controlling shares. We have the notarized will. You have a piece of paper that entitles Elise to the domestic bank accounts and the real estate," Montgomery countered, dropping a massive leather-bound portfolio onto the mahogany table with a deafening thud. "What you don't have, Wallace, is the basic competence to verify corporate structure." Conrad looked up from his tablet, frowning. "Mom, what is he talking about?" David walked slowly toward the head of the table, his eyes locked on his stepmother. "Grandpa knew exactly what you were doing, Elise. He knew you were manipulating him. So 3 years ago, he moved all the voting shares of this company into an offshore holding firm called Vanguard Horizon." Grendel's face turned an ashen shade of grey. He lunged for the portfolio, frantically flipping through the authenticated Swiss documents. This is impossible. The trust beneficiary. Montgomery interrupted loudly, making sure every board member heard him. "Is legally defined as the deeded owner of a parcel of land located at 442 Hemlock Lane in Pennsylvania. A deed that you, Wallace, so graciously expedited into my client's name 2 days ago." A shocked gasp rippled through the board of directors. They were seasoned executives. They instantly understood the gravity of the legal trap. "No," Elise shrieked, her composed facade completely shattering. She pointed a trembling finger at David. "That was a garbage property, a rotting pile of wood. He left you nothing." "He left me the key." "Elise," David said softly, stopping just inches from her. "You thought you were burying me. You thought you were sending me into exile. Instead, you signed over a $2 billion empire to me with your own pen." "This is fraud," Conrad yelled, finally realizing his yacht money was evaporating. "We'll sue, you will lose," Montgomery stated coldly. "The transfer is ironclad, ratified by the highest courts in Zurich and recognized by the SEC. David Carmichael controls 80% of the voting shares. Elise, the shares you inherited, are non-voting Class C stocks. You have absolutely no power here." David turned to face the board of directors. "As the controlling shareholder of Carmichael Global Logistics, my first motion is to immediately terminate this liquidation vote. My second motion is to remove Elise Carmichael from the board, effective this exact second, and ban her from all company premises." "You can't do this to me," Elise screamed, her voice cracking, as tears of genuine panic finally spilled down her cheeks. "I was his wife. I deserve this company." "You deserve exactly what you tried to give me," David replied, his voice devoid of any pity. "Nothing." He gestured to the security contractors he had brought with him. "Escort them out of the building. Do not let them take anything that belongs to my grandfather." Elise tried to fight screaming obscenities and clawing at the guards, while Conrad simply sat frozen in shock as they pulled him from his chair. The entire boardroom watched in stunned silence as the two conspirators were physically dragged out of the executive suite, their humiliating exit echoing down the marble hallway. When the doors finally clicked shut, leaving the room in profound silence, David walked around the large mahogany desk. He brushed his hand over the leather back of his grandfather's chair before sitting down at the head of the table. He looked out at the executives, the people who had helped build his family's legacy. "Now," David said, a genuine smile breaking across his face for the first time in weeks. "Let's get back to work. Betrayal can strip you of everything, but as David proved, Sometimes your lowest moment is just the setup for an unimaginable comeback. He took a rotting cabin and used it to legally obliterate the greedy stepmother who tried to ruin his life. If you loved this story of brilliant revenge and family secrets, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life dramas, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it.